Thank you all for joining us today for the panel discussion presented by the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's Academia Symposium Committee, entitled The 30-Year Christian Genocide in the Late Ottoman Period, 1894 to 1924, with the blessings and under the auspices of His Eminence, Archbishop Elpidophoros of America, who will start the discussion today. With an event hosted by the East Mediterranean Business Cultural Alliance, known as EMCA. My name is Luke Katzos, a member of the committee, headed by Archon George Zimar, and I will be today's moderator. Our distinguished panel includes author Thea Halo, Professor Ismini Lam, Dr. Konstantin Hadzi-Dimitriou, Professor Urinek. In addition, Konstantin Tsilflidis, the president of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the US and Canada. This panel discussion will cover the Christian genocide, Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek Orthodox during the period that we mentioned, 1894 to 1924, and specifically the persecution of the Greek Orthodox Christian inhabitants of Smyrna, leading to the burning of Smyrna in September 13, and to the extinguishing of the flames on September 22nd in 1922, 4 days after the Turkish military entered the capital on September the 9th, and leading to the exchange of the Hellenic and Turkish populations in 1923. His Eminence, Archbishop Elpidophoros.
Esteemed Archons of the Ecumenical Throne, distinguished scholars and members of the academic community, beloved brothers and sisters in the Lord. In the centuries since the tragedy of the burning of Smyrna and the exchange of populations in 1923, the landscape of Christian Anatolia has drastically altered, creating shifting geopolitical currents and new religious realities. Your subject for this webinar, the 30-year Christian genocide in the late Ottoman period, is as timely as it is necessary. I say necessary because we have an obligation to all the lives cut short under those most horrific of circumstances. We have an obligation to tell their stories and to never forget. The oral histories of the survivors are now consigned to a few recordings, but through programs like today's, we can still bring this narrative to life by our remembering. For when we remember, we reconnect to their lives and bring them, even if for a moment, bring them back to life, while we all await the general resurrection of the dead at the close of the age. Therefore, your work today is not only of historical value, but of eternal significance. I'm grateful to the Academia Symposia Committee of the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle, and particularly to Archon Deputatos, Ilias Katsos, for moderating the panel discussion, and I'm grateful also to all the participants, the esteemed author Thea Halo, to Professor Ismini Lam, to Dr. Konstantin Hadzi-Dimitriou, Professor Lou Urinek, and Konstantin Tsilfidis, the President of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the United States and Canada. Your subject is a difficult one to hear, for the Christian genocide of the Greek Orthodox, of the Armenians and the Assyrians during the period of 1894 to 1924 is filled with pain which has yet to abate 100 years later. Nevertheless, these conversations must be had because, as I said earlier, We have a sacred duty to the memories of our spiritual ancestors. I thank each and every one of you for your presence today and for your fearless honesty. May our gracious and good God lead all of us, those who victimized and those who were victims. Lead us to a place of understanding, a place of compassion, and ultimately a place of forgiveness. Forgiveness grounded in truth. Through our faith in the capacity of the human family to muster the courage to embrace integrity and veracity as the way forward to a new and brighter future. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Thank you, Your Eminence. For the audience, a little background before we start the panelists and then the panel discussion. The 30-year Christian genocide from 1894 to 1924 during the Late Ottoman Period, and mentioned by the title of the Israeli professors Benny Morris and Dor Zarev's well-known book, is a tragic and deeply disturbing chapter in the annals of history. This period witnessed a systematic persecution and mass killings of Christian populations living in the Ottoman Empire. The Armenian, Assyrian, and Hellenic communities bore the brunt of this horrific campaign, resulting in the loss of countless lives and the irrevocable destruction of cultural heritage. The roots of this genocide can be traced back to the declining Ottoman Empire's attempts to maintain control over its diverse territories and populations. As the empire weakened, it embarked on a path of increasing nationalism and ethnocentrism propagated by the likes of Ziga Gopalk, categorized as the father of Turkish nationalism and even the Grand Master of Turkism, viewing non-Muslims as threats to the unity. The Christian communities, especially the Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks, became targets of suspicion and hostility. The death toll from the Armenian genocide, for example, is estimated to be as high as 2 million people, representing a significant portion of the Armenian population. Similarly, the Assyrian genocide, estimated to be as high as 750,000, and the Hellenic genocide, estimated to be as high as 900,000, faced similar persecution during this period. And Assyrians were subjected, for example, to massacres, deportations, forced conversions to Islam, resulting in a loss of significant portions of their population. The Greek population in areas such as East Thrace, Asia Minor, and Pontus suffered greatly with mass killings, deportations, and the destruction of cultural and religious sites. One of the most tragic aspects of this genocide is the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage. Churches, monasteries, and historical sites that had stood for centuries were reduced to ruins. Priceless manuscripts, artworks, and artifacts were lost forever. The goal was not only to eliminate the Christian populations, but also to erase their presence and history from the region. The international responses to these atrocities was mostly inadequate during the Late Ottoman period. Despite widespread reports of the horrors taking place, there was a lack of a concerted effort by the global community. Some European powers, driven by their own geopolitical interests, did provide some relief and aid to the affected populations, but it was short of what was needed to prevent the genocide. It was only after World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire that the perpetrators of these crimes were held accountable. The Ottoman government and its leaders were tried for war crimes and genocide, but many of them escaped justice. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 and the subsequent Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 established the new boundaries in the region and recognized the Republic of Turkey. However, the issue of acknowledging the genocide and providing reparations to the survivors remains and continues to be a contentious and unresolved matter. The legacy of the 30-year genocide, Christian genocide in the late Ottoman period is a painful and enduring one. The descendants of the survivors would still bear the scars of this tragedy and the memory of those lost lives ongoing. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of hatred, intolerance, and unchecked nationalism. Recognizing and acknowledging this dark chapter in history is essential to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated and that the memory of the victims is honored and preserved. May the memory of those who perished during that period and those who survived with that pain be eternal. I'd like to start our panel discussions now. Our first panelist is Thea Halo, a Pontic and Assyrian painter, journalist, and author of Not Even My Name. Welcome, Thea, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Excuse me. My paper is called Genocide Takes Many Forms. As many know, the term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer of Jewish descent, who campaigned to establish the Genocide Convention laid out by the United Nations on December 9, 1948, and adopted on January 12, 1951. Although many people might believe that the definition of genocide only refers to the killing of a large number or all of a particular religious, ethnic, or racial group, the official definition is more broad. The key provisions of the Genocide Convention defines genocide as any of a number of acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, which includes killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another ethnic or religious group. Raphael Lemkin included a list of actions that, although non-lethal in themselves, still add to the destruction of the targeted group and therefore fits into the definition of genocide. Lemkin writes that the confiscation of property of nationals of an occupied area on the grounds that they have left the country may be considered simply as deprivation of their individual property rights. However, he writes, if the confiscations are ordered against individuals solely because they are Poles, Jews, or Czechs, then the same confiscations tend in effect to weaken the national entities of which these persons are members, end quote. As Turkish historian Thea Archon points out, in A Shameful Act, members of the CUP and their cohorts became wealthy or even wealthier from confiscated Armenian properties. Undoubtedly, this held true for the Greek and Assyrian properties as well. Australian scholar Dirk Moses writes, quote, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accompanied by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves, end quote. Lemkin defined genocide as having two phases, quote, one, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed groups, the other, imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone, after removal of the population and the colonization by the oppressor's own nationals, end quote. Lemkin's description perfectly describes the actions taken against the Greeks in Eastern Thrace in 1913, and then again against the Greeks along the Aegean coast beginning in 1914, before and during World War I. The Young Turks professed policy to bring Muslim immigrants from the Balkans to Eastern Thrace in 1913 and to Anatolia to live among the Greeks in 1914 does not fully describe the real intent of the Young Turk policies. In fact, the Young Turks' intent was that the Muslims would supplant the Greeks of Anatolia. In Thrace, they did so immediately. The method employed by the Young Turks to force Greece to abandon their homes included brutal assaults, murders, rapes, boycotts, and theft of property. Similar methods were later used for assaults on the Assyrians in 1914 and in 1915 against the Greeks of the Pontus region and on the Armenians, and again against the Pontic Greeks in 1919 and the 1920s when Mustafa Kemal gained power. Therefore, in keeping with Lemkin's analysis, even the term Ottomanization of the Christians, or more accurately, Turkification, is insufficient to describe both the intent and the actions taken by the Young Turk and Kemalist regimes to attack their Greek, Assyrian, and Armenian subjects in a physical sense, after which these Christians were, in Lemkin's terms, removed and supplanted by populations of the oppressor nation. Which brings us to the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. I would contend that the exchange of populations, the exchange of populations also fits the conventions described a description of genocide, even though the exchange was agreed upon by both Greece and Turkey, according to Turkish professor M. Sukro Hanioglu. Quote, Ataturk embraced German historian Walter Wilhelm Goethe's nation-state ideology, arguing that the Ottoman Empire should voluntarily dissolve itself and exchange different ethnic populations that would give rise to a Turkish state. End quote. The Treaty of Lausanne, which memorialized the exchange of populations, was signed on July 24, 1923, after numerous death marches, massacres, and the burning of Smyrna, and the decimation of much of the Christian population. The international signatories of the treaty had decided that a compulsory population exchange was necessary to prevent the further deaths of innocent civilians. Historian Norman Neymark claimed that the Lausanne Treaty was the last part of an ethnic cleansing campaign to create an ethnically pure homeland for the Turks. Historian Dinah Shelton similarly wrote that the Lausanne Treaty completed the forcible transfer of the country's Greeks. In fact, both the outright massacre of Greeks and the death marches had continued until the final exchange of populations in 1923. Norman Neymark asserted, quote, even when the forced deportation is not genocidal in its intent, it is often genocidal in its effects. Millions of people in this century have been marched in hungry columns across huge expanses of land and crowded into freight cars, buses, or holds of ships for journeys in which thousands, even tens of thousands, become sick, starve, and die. Even those refugees who survive forced deportations and transportation out of their homelands must deal with hunger, disease, and seeking shelter in new lands out of reach of their persecutors. Many give up on life and commit suicide, end quote. So much of Neymark's observations applies to the Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians. Even after the exchange of populations and the relative safety within the borders of Greece, Greek refugees continue to die, weakened from prolonged starvation, sickness, and disease during the years of abuse and exposure in Anatolia, and the inability of a war-torn, overextended Greece to rise to the need quickly enough to feed and house the roughly 1.2 million refugees, of which 100,000 were Armenians, 1,000 Assyrians, and 9,000 Circassians. Surely these natives of Anatolia would not have given up their homes, lands, and businesses in a country their ancestors had inhabited for over 3 and 4 millennia, unless forced to do so, those who actually changed their religion to Islam, or pretended to do so in order to stay in their homes, also fits into the genocidal convention, as their own culture and ethnic heritage was supplanted by threat or actual force, and over time, many of the converts forgot their real heritage. Although this conference is labeled the 30-year genocide, I'd like to introduce another often overlooked element of the Greek genocide, which began hundreds of years earlier in the 13th century. The subordinate position of Christians over the centuries of Ottoman rule took many forms, such as being forced to pay numerous extra taxes, at times ruinous. Although extra taxes may not be considered genocidal, the policy was another way of forcing conversion to Islam, or at times forcing Christians to abandon their homes and lands. However, the cruelest tax of all was the child levy, or debshem, also known as the blood tax, in which 300 to 1,000 children were taken from their homes each year to become janissaries. Although janissaries would eventually occupy important positions in service to the Sultan, and the taking of children without parental consent was a form of slavery that began during the reign of Orhan I. Ataturk's biographer, Patrick Kinroy, states its use from around 1365 until 1648. That's almost 300 years. The child levy, or debshem, gave the Sultan the right to take the pick of the smartest, strongest, tallest, best-looking Christian boys. In the beginning, these early janissary were taken from Greek families as early as 8 years of age. They were circumcised, brainwashed, converted to Islam, and isolated from their own ethnic and religious communities. The boys were sent to select Turkish families in the provinces to learn to speak Turkish, the rules of Islam, and the customs and cultures of Ottoman society. They were not allowed to marry and observed a forced celibacy when they became adults. They lived in barracks in complete service to the Sultan. Trained as civil servants, palace guards, and elite Turkish soldiers, the janissaries served as both the military and administrative power for the empire, and were often unwittingly used against their own ethnic people. Christian boys from the Balkan states were later accepted into the corps. According to historian Stanford Shaw, Jews and even Armenians were safe from the boy tax, and until the 16th century, Muslims were also bypassed. Although the word recruited is often used, such a term is questionable at best, especially in the early centuries when the taking of children from their homes to become janissaries was done regardless of parental consent. Mothers were often seen wailing after their children as they were taken away by the soldiers. It was only after centuries of this practice that Muslims were allowed to enlist and become janissaries, and janissaries were allowed to marry. As noted earlier, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and forcibly transferring children of one group to another ethnic or religious group is part of the Genocide Convention. The International Criminal Court added enslavement, deportation, torture, rape, sexual slavery, and forced disappearances and apartheid to the Genocide Convention. Therefore, the forcible transfer of the best and brightest Greek boys to another ethnic and religious group, while imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group with forced celibacy, perfectly fits the definition of genocide, as it removed these best and brightest from the bloodlines of the ethnic communities from which the boys were taken, a kind of genetic genocide, some 600 years before the final solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thea. Our next panelist is Dr. Constantine Hatsidimitriou, a historian, adjunct professor at St. John's University and City University of New York, and author of American Accounts Documenting the Destruction of Smyrna, 1922. Welcome, Constantine, and thank you for being with us today.
He might lost connection because I don't see him.
We may have lost Constantine. Okay, why don't we, okay, I'm sure he'll come back. So why don't we go to Professor Isminia Lamb? She's the director of the Modern Greek Studies program at Georgetown University, where she has taught Greek language, history, and culture for more than 30 years. And she's the co-author with Christopher Lamb of The Gentle America, George Horton's Odyssey, and his true account of the Smyrna catastrophe. Welcome, Isminia, and thank you for being with us today. Isminia, you have to unmute yourself. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Isminia.
Forgive me. Well, thank you, Lou, for that nice introduction, and also thank you for including me on such a distinguished panel. Good, my understanding of our topic today comes from researching George Horton's biography. And of course, most of us know that Horton was the US consul in Smyrna when Kemalist nationalists burned and destroyed it in 1922. But my understanding also comes from researching Horton's tenure as an American diplomat in the Near East from 1893 to 1923, which overlaps almost perfectly with the 30-year genocide. What Horton experienced, knew, and documented in his writing challenged existing historiography. This afternoon, I want to review one aspect of this great tragedy and something that Horton much remarked upon, but to this day, it remains widely unrecognized. I want to examine the American role in promoting Turkish propaganda, including what I like to call the big lie that Turkish officials promulgated. The big lie was the claim that Turkish Muslims were being mass murdered by Christians rather than the reverse. For example, Kemal told a September 1919 gathering of his Turkish nationalists that Greeks were guilty of, and I quote him, general massacre of the Muslim population, and that the Armenian Republic at Yerevan was carrying out, quote, a policy of extermination against the region Muslims. Well, this is the exact opposite of the truth of what was really happening. As Morris and Zivi note in their authoritative book, The 30-Year Genocide, that you mentioned earlier, Lou, their words are that it is incontrovertible that the Turks pursued the genocide and ethnic cleansing of all Christians over 3 decades. Yet, Turkish leaders made every effort to not only hide the truth, but to portray themselves as victims. In their book, Morris and Zivi illustrate how consistently the Turks falsely accuse the allies, and especially the Greeks, of doing precisely what they, the Turks themselves, were doing with their massacres. Yet, amazingly, Turkish propaganda was quite successful. The big lie grew in strength rather than diminished. During World War I, the Allies had no doubts about Turkish mass murder. In fact, Britain, France, and Russia issued a joint public protest against the genocide and promised to hold Ottoman officials personally accountable for those crimes. In America, former President Theodore Roosevelt demanded a declaration of war against the Ottomans. He wrote to President Woodrow Wilson that, quote, the Armenian massacre was the greatest crime of the war, and the failure to act against Turkey is to condone it, end of quote. Yet, 6 years later, there was widespread confusion about the violence and who was responsible for it. What happened? It is my contention that the success of Turkish propaganda was critically enabled by false statements from Allied officials and key US officials in particular. Before explaining why, I want to offer several caveats that help put the American role in perspective. First, I want to acknowledge that there are, of course, multiple factors involved in the success of Turkish propaganda. The Turks have maintained a long-running and systematically enforced campaign to suppress the truth, and they put out as much disinformation as they can. The Turks did not need to convince people the big lie was true. They just had to confuse the public opinion sufficiently to forestall concerted action by the Allies. And in that, they were successful. The second caveat is that the Italians and French did even more to assist the Turkish nationalists. They provided them with weapons, training, and intelligence. Italy and France intervened in allied councils to aid the Turkish cause, and senior French diplomats and military men also told bold-faced lies about the genocide. So, US officials were not the only ones aiding Turkey. The third caveat is that the United States alone tried to help Greece with their massive flow of refugees. By the end of 1920s, it was estimated that the massive US aid effort saved between 1 and 2 million lives, including hundreds of thousands of orphans. The Armenian Patriarch claimed American relief efforts had, and I quote him, performed a miracle by saving the orphans. And the King of Greece, while decorating American nurses, said, and I quote him, "We'll always remember with gratitude what the American people have done through you in our hour of need," end of quote. So when we speak of American support for Turkish propaganda, it is important to realize that they're only speaking about a small number of key officials. Despite those caveats, I believe Admiral Mark Bristol, the senior US official in Constantinople, and his friend Alan Dulles, who was running the Department of State's Near East Division at the time, played a critical role in Turkish propaganda. In part, they could do so because the United States had a commanding position in Allied councils after World War I. The United States was popular and viewed as a disinterested party, unlike Britain and France, which had colonies in the region. In addition, US loans were key in financing post-war recovery in Europe, and the Europeans could not very well afford to alienate the United States. So America was often the swing vote when the exhausted British and French were at loggerheads, which happened frequently. Also in 1922, the US national security bureaucracy was minuscule compared to today, and particularly the Department of State staff. So a few key officials like Bristol and Dulles could have an outsized influence on policy since they oversaw Near East policy. Both of these were unscrupulous about using their influence, and both men believed getting access to Turkish oil was a national imperative, and they did not care what they had to do to get it. Dulles was willing to mislead and lie to both Congress and his superiors. And Bristol, well, he cajoled, bullied, threatened, and punished people who did not do his bidding, as several recent histories, including our Horton biography, document. For these reasons, the role Bristol and Dulles played during the genocide was more consequential than many people realize. To give you a better idea of what they were willing to do, I want to provide some illustrative examples. The first example is the May 1919 landing of Greek troops in Smyrna. Bristol, perceived as the unbiased American, led the Allied investigation of the 1919 Greek landing at Smyrna, but he was anything but unbiased. His report actually inverted history, blaming the Greeks for the violence during the landing, even though it was initiated by the Turks, who carefully planned and executed an ambush of the arriving Greek soldiers. Bristol Bristol's report, rather, gave the Turks a huge propaganda victory that helped fuel the nationalist cause. The second example is Bristol's reporting on the 1920 massacres in Marash. In January and February, the Turks were slaughtering an estimated 10,000 Armenian men, women, and children in Marash, in Turkey. First, Bristol reported there were no massacres taking place. Reports to the contrary, Bristol said, were deliberate propaganda. On February 7, he acknowledged horrific atrocities had taken place, but inverted the truth yet again, saying the French and Armenians were guilty of hacking Turks to death with axes, including women and children. When the Turks killed 2 American missionaries, however, and their colleagues reported to American newsmen the truth about who was doing the killing, Bristol had to reverse field. He admitted the Turks massacred 10,000 people, but blamed it on the French for failing to provide sufficient security. The third example is the 1921 Pontic horrors. In July 1921, missionaries, as well as Bristol's own naval officers in Black Sea ports, reported that the Turks were mass murdering the Pontic Greeks. Bristol appealed to Kemal to stop the horrors. While Kemal had his Minister of Foreign Affairs respond to Bristol with a bold-faced lie. He told Bristol the reports of Pontic Greek deportations were, and I quote him, completely in error, and that absolutely no measure of this kind has taken place. Bristol readily accepted this denial as credible and passed it on to Washington. He further obliged the Turks by passing along false reports of Greek massacres. The fourth example is Bristol's cold-blooded willingness to sacrifice 60,000 orphans. In November 1921, when American missionaries asked Bristol's help in evacuating 60,000 American orphans from Cilicia, Bristol refused. He said he wanted to give the Turks the chance to prove to the world they would treat the children well. In one of the most chilling passages in the annals of American diplomacy, in my estimation, Bristol wrote in his diary that, and I quote Bristol, "It seemed to me better to sacrifice these orphans if necessary to establish confidence in the mass of the people." End of quote. Bristol was willing to turn the 60,000 children over to the Turks in hopes of securing a propaganda victory for the Turks. Then, of course, there is Bristol's 1922 Smyrna cover-up. When Smyrna was sacked and burned in September 1922, Bristol launched a sustained effort to confuse the world about what really happened. And we detail actually his diverse and sustained efforts in our Horton biography, but in the interest of time, I will not reprise the findings here. Suffice it to say that Bristol's disinformation effort on Smyrna began even before the Turks occupied the city and persisted until 1927, when the US Senate voted down the Lausanne Treaty. Finally, there is Bristol's and Dallas' effort to prevent American intervention following the Smyrna disaster. The culminating example illustrates my earlier point about the US being the key swing vote in Allied councils. There were still about 2.5 million Christians left in Anatolia after the Turks burned Smyrna. When Britain appealed to the US to save the remaining Christians by joining Britain in sending Kemal an ultimatum, Secretary of State Hughes and President Harding decided to reconsider their non-intervention policy. American civil and religious leaders were clamoring for intervention to stop the slaughter, and the British increased the pressure on Hughes and Harding by arguing truthfully that only US action could save the Christians. The British noted that if the US backed the British, France would be forced to do the same. And Kemal would have to desist. But if the United States refused, Britain would be isolated and forced to let Kemal continue the slaughter. Dallas prepared Hughes and Harding for their climactic meeting. He made sure they did not see George Horton's accurate and expert assessment of the situation, even though he was the senior diplomat on the scene and widely recognized for his long record of successful reporting and diplomacy. Instead, Dallas provided the Secretary of State and President Harding with a report that Bristol preferred, one which he had bullied and cajoled a junior diplomat to write, and which was full of misrepresentations. It wrongly reported both sides were at fault, and the truth about who was responsible for the atrocities was uncertain. Not surprisingly, Harding and Hughes decided not to intervene. Without US support, Britain backed down, the slaughter continued, and the stage was set for the abominable Lausanne Treaty that rewarded Turkey for genocide. I could cite many other examples of Bristol and Dallas machinations. For example, the two men made it official US policy after Smyrna's demise to prohibit any public or private aid for refugees flooding into Greece. Thankfully, Horton and other like-minded humanitarians were able to reverse their decision. But the main point I want to make is that contrary to what most historians write, Bristol and Dallas did nothing positive for US policy in the Near East. They did not increase presence, American presence, influence, or trade in the region. They just facilitated genocide. Because of that, I believe Americans have a special obligation to make the truth about the 30-year genocide known today. This is one reason why I'm so pleased and honored to be part of this panel. And with that, I conclude my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Ismenias, thank you so much for that. Do we have Dr. Constantine Hadjidimitriou on board now or not yet? Costa?
Hopefully, I will not get knocked off again.
Okay.
I've got
Hold it.
I guess the is not as reliable as the old one.
Hold on a second. I have to introduce you. Okay, so our next panelist is Dr. Constantine Hadjidimitriou, a historian, adjunct professor at St. John's University and City University of New York, and author of American accounts documenting the destruction of Smyrna, 1922. Welcome and thank you for being with us, Constantine.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Lou Gatsos for inviting me and the Archdiocese Archons for including me on this very distinguished panel. I must also acknowledge your fellow Archons, since this is sponsored by the Archons, Bill Theodosakis, who for decades worked on publicizing and making the genocide and specifically the destruction of Smyrna known. And I have to also acknowledge the late Aristides Karatzas and George Mavropoulos of the Asia Minor and Pontian Center for publishing my work. My distinguished colleagues have talked about things in a more broad way. I talk about and present on something very narrow. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully I'll succeed and get my PowerPoint up. And you'll see what I'm talking about from my title. Okay, I guess, yes. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we got it.
You got it? Okay.
Yep, we got it.
Let's find the PowerPoint. Where is it hiding? Yes, there it is. Okay. Great. As you can see, my topic is very, very specific. I deal with American documents that I feel prove that the Turks burned the city and massacred thousands in 1922. Like my friend and colleague, Thea Halo, the subject is extremely personal for me. It's not just an academic exercise. Why is it personal? My mother was actually there. And I want to begin by pointing out that the Turks began this genocide not 30 years, over a 30-year period, but really from the 12th century. This was documented by Spiros Brionis in a detailed large study on the de-Hellenization of Asia Minor in 1971 that he published. In fact, the destruction of Smyrna in 1922 was the second destruction. The first was in 1330, 1332 by one of the Emirates, the Turkish Emirates, and it's described to us in some detail by the Muslim traveler Ibn Battuta. Consul Horton, who Professor Lamb has just talked about, called Ottoman history in his book, The Blight of Asia, largely a history of massacres. And it goes back over 800 years. I began this work specifically on Smyrna because of a personal connection. My mother, the young child here, she was 2 years old, and her entire family were in Smyrna in 1922. I also began working on it about 30 years ago in the 1980s. It's moving on its own. That's interesting. Okay. I began working on this about 30 years ago. And one of the things that one of my relatives entrusted to me was a memoir, which I published in the 1990s on her personal account. You see it here. So this has been a personal enterprise for me for a very, very long time. I went to the archives in Washington, and in 2005 published this book in 2005 documenting things. It was recently done in Greek last summer. Luke, can Constantine take over and I'll stop sharing because this thing seems to be moving on its own.
Costa, if you can take over the PowerPoint from your end, okay?
Okay. Yeah, just bring me to that point and I'll continue. Thanks. Just move it along to the, I guess, the third or fourth slide. Keep going. Thank you. So the book came out in 2005. Over a long period of time, I would go to the archives in Washington when I had the time, and I would dig out information. Stop here on Horton. So it came out in Greek last summer, and I also published a detailed article with a lot of article information in 2012. Constantine, next slide. I'll just prompt you that way. Next slide. Okay, the two individuals, which Professor Lamb has already so ably outlined for you, are Consul Horton. Here you see what he looks like. He had previously served as in Athens and in Thessaloniki. He spoke several languages. He was married to a Greek, but Bristol, who you've already heard about, the High Commissioner, U.S. Representative, declared him to be fair and square. He was a scholar, a journalist, a writer of fiction and nonfiction. His reports to Washington actually predicted the catastrophe and published many details of Turkish atrocities. And all of this is for the first time available in more detail than we've ever had before in Professor Lamb recent book based on the Horton archives that's come out on Consul Horton, which is very important, and I recommend it. And I don't want to leave out my other two colleagues, Thea Halo's book outlined of the personal story of her mother, but Thea single-handedly got the International Association of Genocide Scholars to recognize the Pontic and Greek Assyrian genocide, which had never happened before. And whenever I speak, I try to acknowledge that because she single-handedly did this, and it took a lot of effort on her part. And of course, Professor Utrecht's book on this the Smyrna catastrophe itself gives you a detailed, day-by-day, hour-by-hour, well-documented account of what took place. Mine is much more narrow. He also testified, Horton testified in a committee in front of Congress, which I'll refer to in a moment. Let's move on. Next slide. Admiral Bristol, there he is. He was the U.S. High Commissioner who distorted information, as we already heard, going to Washington. He was in charge of the American fleet, and he ordered the ships to maintain strict neutrality, like other countries did. In spite of the atrocities, they sat there and watched people being slaughtered for a long time. He was a colleague and friend of Allen Dulles, head of the Near Eastern desk in the State Department, later on, who became very prominent in American intelligence. He had ties to Standard Oil and American business interests. He was pro-Kemalist Turkey, biased against the Greeks and Armenians, and as we've already heard, emphasized Greek atrocities on the Turks. He did not trust Horton and opposed his views. He didn't trust the missionaries either, and also tried to minimize what they said. He was a founding member of the American Friends of Turkey, which for a long time in the United States, and its successor exists today, tried to always cover up for Turkish atrocities and what the Kemalists did in 1922 and thereafter. Next slide. Here's the what the catastrophe, the burning of the city, looks like, just so we get a visual and understand what we're talking about. Next slide. The devastation was total. It's horrific, and we have many, many detailed accounts by various sources as to what was left after the European. Only the European sections, the Greek and Armenian sections, the Christian sections of the city were burned. Next slide. So I, in the archives, feel that I found 4 key documents that were originally secret and classified that prove that the Turks burned the city, and incidentally show that the United States covered it up. The first is a wire telegraph from Lieutenant Merrill, Bristol's intelligence officer, dated 9/14/22, the day after the fire started. We have also, the second is a summary document of numerous reports given to Secretary of State Hughes, dated September 15th, 1922. And as Mini pointed out, this information also went all the way up to the president, although they tried to block Horton's reports as much as possible. The third item is Lieutenant Merrill, the intelligence officer, the Bristol's naval intelligence officer, which became part of the official record in the State Department, his diary. And he had 2 entries that also are particularly relevant. And then the longest document I found was a lengthy confidential British document sent to the State Department in November 1922, based on numerous reports, and which also asks for similar American documents. These are part of other Greek and Armenian sources I published in 2005 and 2012. We also have that congressional committee, which I'll talk about briefly going forward. Next slide. So what does Merrill's document say? Following from Smyrna, 14th, am convinced Turks burned Smyrna except Turkish section conforming with definite plan to solve Christian minority problem by forcing allies to evacuate Christian minorities. Believe that they will now prepare for an attack on Constantinople. Merrill. This was sent to Bristol. Bristol passed it on to Washington. We know that it was received. If you notice these numbers on the top, they're called index numbers. That 767, all of these State Department documents have those numbers. And that's how you know that they're official. And when you go to the archives, you can find the actual piece of paper by using that index number. That's why I always try to cite them. And I list them all in my book. Next slide. That's document number 1. Document number 2, the document that I told you went to Hughes, the Secretary of State. And you skipped. Okay. Situation in Near East extremely acute with possibility of complications which would involve Great Britain and allies in war. Confidential reports received from our many officials at Smyrna and British Foreign Office indicate that the Turks burned the city in conformity with a definite plan to solve the Christian minority problem by forcing the evacuation of the minorities. The return of several 100,000 Christians to their homes is apparently made impossible by the wholesale destruction of villages by retreating Greeks as well as by advancing Turks. Reports indicate heavy loss of American property in Smyrna. Native Americans are all safe. And that's always interesting in the documents. They made a distinction between what they called Native Americans and any Greek Americans. No further details received regarding missing naturalized citizens, although they had information. 3 American destroyers still in Smyrna, assisting relief workers and protecting American property. Next slide. That's Hughes. I just wanted you to see what the guy looked like. And next one is President Harding, the fellow at the top who allowed all of this to happen and didn't, as Professor Lamb just told you, didn't send any official American aid, but left it to the public sector. This was actually discussed. I found documents where it was discussed and it was decided that only private aid should be given. Next slide. Lieutenant Merrill's diary. Now, remember, the fire broke out on the 13th. So this is his entry for the 14th, just like the wire that went out. All morning, the glow and then the flames burning Smyrna could be seen. We arrived about an hour before dawn, and the scene was indescribable. The entire city was ablaze, and the harbor was light as day. Thousands of homeless refugees were surging back and forth on the blistering quay, including my mother and her entire family. Panic-stricken to the point of insanity, the heart-rending shrieks of women and children were painful to hear. We had 2 men ashore from the Lawrence, that's a destroyer, acting as chauffeur. I located the 2 sailors in their cars. Their stories were identical. They both stated that they had seen Turks spreading the fire. The Turks used rags soaked in oil, which they threw in windows as they ran down the narrow streets. Next slide. Merrill's diary for the 16th. The Turks say the fire was set by the Armenians, and that of the 22nd, and that 22nd of the guilty parties confessed. That the Turks only burned houses fighting the fire with fire. By the way, a well-known scholar at Princeton University argued that that was the reason why Turks were seen starting fires. The French pretend to believe this. I am convinced in my own mind that the Turks burned the town. They burned it to force the Allies to evacuate the non-Muslims. Their slogan is Turkey for the Turks. They consider that all their troubles during the last 40 years can be attributed to the propaganda spread by Christian minorities, and that the only solution is to remove these minorities. Next slide. This is the British document that I alluded to before. It's very long. It's about 15, 20 pages. This is the cover page, ladies and gentlemen. His Majesty's ambassador, note the numbers again, those index numbers, is instructed to communicate unofficially to the United States government the accompanying copy of the preliminary report on the sacking of Smyrna from His Majesty's High Commissioner at Constantinople, Bristol's counterpart. It will be observed that the evidence contained therein all points to the conclusion that the European and native Christian quarters were systematically destroyed by the Turks as part of a deliberate policy. If the United States government are prepared to communicate in the same way reports which may have reached them upon this subject, His Majesty's government will be glad to receive them. End of quote. Move on. And as I mentioned, hearings were held in Washington, D.C. Officially on December 1922. Horton and many others gave eyewitness testimony. This document is, again, lengthy. It has not been published. I hope to publish large portions of it in the near future and do an analysis. You can find out in the meantime what some of the contents are and some of the quotes in Professor Lamb's recent book on Horton. Next. The U.S. cover-up, what I called in writing Smyrna Gate, tongue-in-cheek. Instead of sending the British the documents we have reviewed, or any of U.S. Consul Horton's reports, which talked about Turkish culpability, and we have many of them, as you heard already, the State Department sent the British a report by Vice Consul Barnes, which minimized Turkish responsibility and loss of life. And also, I have found a note that Dulles appended to it, and it went to Hughes. The State Department lied to Congress also. This is how they responded to a inquiry in February of 23 from Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who asked officially a number of questions. One of them was, who burned the consulate? And how did the American consulate get burned during the fire? This was the official response, which I published in the book. As the consulate building was destroyed in the general conflagration, it is not possible to attribute the destruction of this particular building to the individual act of any person or persons. As far as the department is informed, the authors of the fires, apparently of incendiary origin, which brought on the Smyrna conflagration, have never been apprehended, nor their identity discovered. On this point, conflicting evidence has been received by the department, and the various antagonistic racial groups in Smyrna have each attributed the origin of the fire to each other. Compare that to the official documents we just saw. This response also ignored an official report. Again, I published the contents of it by Vice Consul Barnes and Clifton Davis of the Red Cross, who were sitting on the steps of the consulate and actually saw and reported that the Turks were spreading petroleum on the steps, leading and setting the consulate on fire. It's just incredible, ladies and gentlemen. Next. This is the cover letter to Professor Lamb alluded to it before, that what they sent was the Barnes report. go back, please, just for a moment. The Barnes report, instead of Horton's reports, which Horton was the senior diplomat. He was the most senior diplomat in Smyrna at the time. And it references the British document and advises the State Department, Phillips is the assistant secretary, that they should send the Barnes report and not anything else. So you see how the conspiracy operated in detail. Next slide. Here you see the actual notes. That's why paper is so good. I don't know what we're going to do in the internet age, where hopefully emails will survive and get printed out. But you see Dulles' notes to the secretary on how the Barnes report and the British situation should be handled. And it says that no, you see at the top right-hand corner, the gist of that, you probably can't read it, is that the atrocities should be minimized. Next slide. I also published a series of documents which were originally secret. They were very upset, and the conspiracy continued well into 1924. They were also concerned about not only Horton's book, but a book came out called The Great Betrayal by a man called Bierstadt, who was the executive secretary of the Near East refugees, which was very well informed. And he argued that the State Department, the US government, covered everything up because of economics. And I also, while all of these atrocities were taking place, the US government had secret economic liaisons negotiating with the Turks. The Lausanne Treaty, he says, was signed with the blood of actually Armenians and Greeks, is a quote from the book. Also, there are a series of State Department documents by Dulles, Bristol, and others, which outline how they systematically tried to suppress this information and tragically even recruited Asa Jennings, who I'm sure Professor Utrecht will mention, who played a heroic role, was then recruited to the Turkish side, and whose entire family was involved in supporting Turkey for the rest of the 20th century. I'm sure that Professor Lamb, I said, I thought she was going to go before me. The documents presented here, I think, speak for themselves and prove, I believe, that the Turks burned the city and the U.S. knew about it and covered it up. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope I didn't take too long.
No, you didn't, Constantine. Thank you for being with us today. Our next panelist is Lou Urinek, a retired professor of journalism at Boston University and author of The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue the Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. Thank you, Lou, for being with us today.
Lou, thank you for having me. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists for these compelling, factual, and insightful presentations that they've made. It's really been very enlightening and interesting, and I'm honored to be included. They all have covered a lot of ground, so I'm going to try to provide a bit of a postscript here, and I'll try to be brief. I'm going to make 3 points, and the second point blends into the third point and centers on the city of Smyrna, which is especially important in a discussion of this genocide. I think that the first thing I want to say, it's worth noting the important shift that's occurred in the conversation about the genocide in the last 7 or 8 years. When I first undertook the research for my book on Smyrna, oh goodness, more than 10 years ago, I guess I began sometime around 2010, there was sort of general acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. And this by virtue of the enormous work that the Armenian diaspora had done to bring the character, that the violent nature and the scope of the Armenian genocide forward to an international audience. There was mostly, at that time, an unacknowledged Ionian Greek genocide. One rarely read of it or heard of it. There was scant information about it really in the scholarship, and certainly there were no panels of this sort talking about what we now sometimes call the Ionian Greek genocide. And then, of course, there was and is the Pontic genocide, which and the conversation about that, it seems to me, has shifted importantly as well. There seemed to be sort of an argument inside Greece about the nature of the Pontic genocide. Was it really a genocide or not? Of course, it was, but there was a certain contested aspect to this. This has changed tremendously. The conversation has moved. I'm very, very happy to say, by virtue of these kinds of panels and more research, the conversation has moved forward. And now there is not only a discussion of all three genocides, we're coming, and I think appropriately, to regard it as a single genocide. And you have captured this in the title of this panel discussion. That, I would suggest, is a relatively new idea, given the history of these genocides. Oddly, and this is an issue that I struggle with, oddly, it's in Greece itself that the conversation has stalled. Greece, to me, it seems, is a laggard in this conversation about the genocide that occurred in Asia Minor. And I would especially fault the academic community in Greece. The reasons for this are complex. They sort of go beyond my ability as an American scholar and historian to analyze it, but it's something that I think needs to be talked about and dealt with, largely as a consequence of intelligent, energetic people like Lou Katsos. These genocide issues have become a topic for the diaspora to discuss and develop in ways that don't occur inside the nation of Greece. Now, it's changing, and I'm glad it's changing for the better. But I am shocked when I'm in Greece to see the gap in the conversation and the scholarship that occurs Greece and the rest of the world. Okay, so I got that off my chest. The second point I want to make, and I'm going to try to make this as a series of bullet points, and then I'm going to transition into a quick talk about Smyrna. Second point I want to make is the importance of contextualizing the genocide. I think it's important to understand the reasons behind it. Now, when I say reasons, I don't mean justifications. There is no justification for genocide. What happened is fully inexcusable. It's a historical fact. It's horrible, but it happened for reasons that we should try to understand. And the reason I suggest this is because if we have some understanding of the context in which the genocide occurred, it helps root the veracity, the truth, the reality of the genocide in the public consciousness. Otherwise, there is a kind of confusion. And as some of the previous panels have pointed out, those who have denied the genocide in the past have used this confusion to deflect and to deny it. So I'm going to sort of bullet point some reasons that I think that it occurred. I also want to say parenthetically here that I typically date the genocide 1912 to 1922. And the reason I do that is because I think that the killings, especially of the Greeks, accelerated following the Balkan Wars. Now, Lou has chosen 1895, an earlier date, and I think that that's valid. And I'm actually happy that he did that, because it does sort of include more generally this idea that the Armenian, the Greek, the two Greek and the Assyrian genocides were in fact a single thing. And of course, 1895 is when Sultan Hamid, the Hamidian massacres occurred and so forth. So I think that that's a good start date, 1895 to 1922, 23 as well. So, why the genocide? Just really very quickly, I think of declining empires as being radioactive. They put out negative energy, very bad energy. And if we need a contemporary example of that, we can look at what's happening in Russia right now. There is a decline and there's a nostalgia. And as a consequence, we're seeing an invasion of Ukraine and a kind of genocide that is occurring in Eastern Ukraine. Now, the parallel is not exact, but there was certainly a decline of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, into the early 20th. And it's in that context that we need to understand what happened. There was tremendous internal frustration inside the Ottoman Empire among its highest officials, its brightest military leaders, and so forth, about the inefficiencies of the empire. It was falling apart, and there seemed to be nothing that they could do about it. And they needed a scapegoat. Okay, so there's one reason. There were foreign defeats. They were losing land in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire was losing land in the Balkans, losing islands in the Mediterranean. So there was a real loss of territory. Another thing that we need to acknowledge as we try to understand, not justify, but understand what happened, was the commercial success of the Greeks and the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. By and large, Asia Minor was a very poor place. There were some rich Turks, of course, and of course the Sultan had almost unlimited wealth, but it was a very poor place. But there were these entrepôts like Smyrna that were quite wealthy, and that wealth was largely built on the entrepreneurship, the acumen, and the energy of Greeks and Armenians. That was bound to create jealousy, and I think that it did. I think we also have to acknowledge that there were nationalist impulses inside the empire by both Greeks and Armenians. And these nationalist impulses ranged from just sort of gathering as national groups to actually wanting to have their own separate nations or be part of, the Greek mainland. And those were viewed by the Turks as dangerous movements. I think we also have to acknowledge that as a consequence of the Balkan Wars, there was a tremendous movement of peoples. Muslims were leaving the Balkans, and they were coming into Asia Minor, and they were looking for places to live, and in cruel and totally illegal ways, they were pushing out, especially along the Ionian coast. George Horton has been mentioned here quite a bit. He documented this quite well. They were coming into the Ionian coast around Smyrna and so forth, and pushing out the Greeks who lived there. And so there was a movement of peoples that created tremendous friction as well. And then finally, and perhaps this is the most difficult one to get a handle on. I am not a theologian. I'm not a scholar of Islam, but I think we have to identify Islam as part of the reason that the genocide occurred, especially conservative Islamic clerics inside the Ottoman Empire. Islam accorded Christianity second-class status, and even that is a kind of euphemism. It was, the Greeks and the Armenians were sort of the blacks, let's put it that way, of the American South, but in in Asia Minor. There were all sorts of laws that didn't apply to them: taxation, bad treatment, punishment for all sorts of things, permission to have churches, permission for burials. There were all these sorts of things, and those attitudes grew out of Islam. And we think of, for example, infidel Izmir, Gavur Izmir. That's a religious dimension to the and not a political dimension to the genocide. I think that there was a brief attempt to accommodate different nationalities. Early on, around 1908, the Young Turk Constitution sought to accommodate the different ethnicities and have a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire. But that foundered mostly on the reaction by Islamic leaders. So there are reasons for the genocide. Again, they're not justifications, but we need to understand what happened. And I think when we look at these reasons, we can draw some parallels to what happened in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. Genocide was a ghastly overreaction by a decrepit empire, I think, for the reasons that I've enumerated above. Okay, so let me say just a little bit about Smyrna, which I know something about. The destruction of Smyrna was significant for many reasons. We need to remind ourselves it was the last violent episode of this genocide that had lasted 30 years. It was not only the last violent episode, it was the event that ended and sealed the end of Hellenism in Asia Minor. Now, Smyrna was different than nearly all other places in Asia Minor by virtue of its wealth, its cosmopolitan nature, and so forth. But also, it was a kind of microcosm of what was happening and the frictions that I've tried to describe above that contextualize the genocide. The Muslim population, by and large, saw, let me back up just a moment. I think that there has been in recent years, and some of this emanates from popular, I don't want to call it scholarship, but popular work on the subject in Greece, that there was somehow this religious, great religious toleration that existed in Smyrna, that it was a kind of metropolitan place of mutual understanding. Well, a certain amount of that was true, but not entirely. There was friction among the various groups. The various groups did business with each other. They spoke each other's languages. Sometimes they visited each other's homes and so forth. But there was religious friction in Smyrna. There's no question about it. And the non-Islamic practices of the Christians, the Greeks in particular, often rub the Muslims the wrong way. Gavur Izmir, short skirts, Western music, movies, alcohol, the fun-loving cosmopolitan nature of the city, and so forth. This did not sit well with all of the Muslim population. Also in Smyrna, and I think by virtue of its wealth, its learning, and other factors, it gave rise to strong Hellenic nationalistic impulses. There was a desire among many Greeks in Smyrna for what we in Crete we call enosis, right? For the reconnection to Greece. And this was bound to be a challenge to the Ottoman hierarchy and then later to the Kemalist type of hierarchy and so forth. These nationalist impulses were often positive, for sure. We saw these really terrific Greek schools and Armenian schools, Greek athletic teams, Armenian publishers. Smyrna was the capital of Armenian publishing in the world. But these national impulses existed in Smyrna in very strong ways, and I think that they represented a kind of threat in the minds of many of the Ottomans. Something else that needs to be said about Smyrna, which I think has been under-researched by the Greek Academy, and I think demands more conversation, is the powerful hold that Smyrna held on the Greek imagination generally. Okay, what do I mean by that? I think a lot of Greeks from the mainland and from the islands, when they thought about sort of starting over or building a life of prosperity, maybe making a fortune, they didn't think about Athens. They didn't think about Salonika. They thought about Smyrna. There was something about Smyrna, this sort of specialness, this garden place, this place of wealth that drew Greeks. Now, of course, Greeks have been on the Ionian coast time immemorial, Herodotus and Homer, and we know that. But there was a tremendous amount of Greek emigration from the islands in particular, but also from the mainland to Smyrna in the late 19th century. There just seemed to be more opportunity there than on the mainland of Greece. Now, in the end, of course, as so many of the panelists have described, Smyrna was burned and tens of thousands of people were killed and hundreds of thousands of people were forced to evacuate. So, you know, Smyrna is real, to my mind, is three things. It's this lost city that existed powerfully in the Greek imagination as a place of prosperity, wealth, and learning, and to some extent also in the Armenian imagination. It was that. It was also this place that came to be destroyed. And so we have to confront the reality of the loss of property and wealth and the loss of life and so forth. And but the third thing that Smyrna represents in my mind, and I want to finish on this note, is that, you know, it was an attempt to make a multicultural city that could work, in which 4 or 5 different ethnic and religious groups could live together, do business together in some sort of harmony. And with the burning of Smyrna and the expulsion of the Christians, that ended, and that dream, which was a dream really of the Belle Epoque, that dream ended forever and is lost forever. And so I'll stop right there and invite my comments from my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Lou, for being with us today. And it's interesting the way you started relating to your issue with what's happening or what happened with Greece as it relates to the concept of discussing the genocide, because I happen to agree with you totally. As I indicated before, I'm in Athens right now. And I've had similar thoughts, by the way, and feelings, because historically it took them decades to even acknowledge the genocide. And it's kind of shocking. It's kind of shocking that most of the let's say discussions with scholars, etc., and movements with regards to recognizing certain things are coming from the diaspora. They are absolutely not coming from where they should be coming, and that's kind of shocking, and has been shocking to me for a long period of time. And part of the reason why years ago we started, as Minya knows about this, why we started years ago, every year basically recognizing not only the genocide, the burning of Smyrna, but also beyond that. In other words, if it stopped at that point, and if something happened in a positive way, we say great. But what happened even beyond that, even with the treaties, where you have the Muslims that were allowed by the treaties, let's say in East Thrace, and where you had on some of the islands, obviously in Constantinople, where you had the Hellenic population, which was supposed to be, kept there, to prosper, etc. And systematically, they destroyed these populations, where let's say around the period that we're talking about, 1922, 1923, 30% of the population of Constantinople was Hellenic. And now, gradually over these years, there's close to 0% of Hellenic people there. Not enough, and don't forget, we had the anniversary recently in September 6th and 7th of the Istanbul pogrom, which destroyed thousands of businesses, burned numerous churches, massive destruction of the population. And again, no one talks about it. No one talks about it. Ismini and I and others on the panel, we did have discussions actually. We did zero in, for example, on the program, but they don't speak enough about it. And in particular, here where I am right now in Athens, in the Hellenic Republic. With that, I'd like to introduce also Konstantin Tsilfidis, the president of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the USA and Canada, to offer some commentary. And Gus, you and I have been talking about different things, and I'm not sure if you're willing to reveal some of the things that we have been talking about in terms of the recognition, in particular in the United States, and in particular with the President of the United States. Gus, can you unmute yourself and just say a few words for us? Gus, unmute yourself. Is he having?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organization of the Archons for, putting this event together. I'd like to thank my friend Lou Katos, who I've had the pleasure of collaborating with on an initiative to stimulate the process of trying to get some form of formal recognition, obviously outside of Greece, because as was stated previously, Greece seems to at times have no interest in this. Am I buffering?
I'm sorry, there's some type of background, and I'm not sure if it's you or somebody else. I'm not sure. Is someone talking in the background or no?
No, there's no one here.
Okay, can we mute ourselves maybe? I'm going to mute myself also.
I hope it's not a hack.
Oh, that's possible. Okay, let's try muting ourselves. And Gus, please continue, please. Thank you. Gus, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, as I said, perhaps at the end, Lou and I can elaborate a little more on this subject. Pleasure to hear from my good friend Thea Halo, who was one of the most instrumental influencers on the recognition of the Pontic Greek genocide by the Association of Genocide Scholars. My dear friend Kostas Hatzidimitriou, who I am familiar with and have worked with in the past. Professor Lou Uranek, I have heard of you, yet I have never had the pleasure of meeting you. Professor Ismini Lam, likewise, I've heard of you, and I am thrilled with the name Ismini, an ancient Greek name, daughter of Oedipus, and sister to Antigone. Let's begin by at least acknowledging the fact that tomorrow is also a Remembrance Day, 9/11. And the reason we should remember it on this occasion, because this is what we're doing today, is the destruction of the Twin Towers and the attack on America itself was done mostly for the same reasons that our ancestors lost their lives. I do not profess to be as knowledgeable about these facts as you well-read researchers and professors are, but what I am is passionate about my culture and about my people, and as a representative of the Pontian diaspora, I'm passionate about the 800 years, 8 centuries full of hatred from, I will not say enemy, but the opposition. And it has been 800 years that, you know, Constantinople was under attack, and the Ionian has been under attack, Thrace has been under attack, Pontus has been under attack, Smyrna was burned. So throughout these 800 years, it's always been one big lie from, like I said, the opposition. It's always been trying to cover it up. It's always been trying to reverse it. For the past 100 years, they have spent more money probably than most small countries have at their disposal for the operation of their entire countries, just to spread this lie and to cover up the truth. Turkey, in my opinion, cannot boast of a history, but of a criminal record. Everything they have, in my estimation, has been stolen at the point of the gun, at the point of the sword from other cultures. Turkish propaganda money versus Greek money that I guess from what was stated earlier by Professor Uranek and what Lou also agreed with, is that it seems like Greece has no interest or does not want to get itself involved in this conflict for whatever reasons. But we know that truth is on our side. At the same time, Greece was the first to jump in and support Ukraine with an over $170 million contribution in supplies and arms. And Greece is at the bottom of the economic chart in Europe. Did we have to be the first? I mean, couldn't we have been second or third with less money? Couldn't some of that money have been spent towards some of the issues that occupy our minds on a daily basis? I want to congratulate the Armenians for what they have done up to now, and to thank them for including us always in their process. The question is, what do we do now? What do we have at our disposal? We know that Greece is not willing to spend the money. Quite clearly, what Lou said earlier, it took decades upon decades for them to even have a day of remembrance for our people. They claim that they recognize the genocide of the Greeks of Pontus. Likewise, later on, they set remembrance dates for Thrace and for Asia Minor. But there is no official state-sanctioned resolution recognizing the genocide of the Greeks under the Ottoman Empire. If there was, it would be a punishable offense to deny the genocide of the Greeks in Greece. It is a punishable offense to deny the Holocaust in Greece. It is a punishable offense to deny the genocide of the Armenians in Greece. Imagine if the reverse was happening in Armenia or in Israel. It is not a punishable offense to deny the genocide of the Greeks in Greece. We only got a day of remembrance. So what do we do now? We use all resources at our disposal, and the biggest resource that we have is the truth being revealed by people such as you, who do your research, who do your extensive hard work to provide us with these things. It is by utilizing people, and I will mention one name, and I'm sure there are others, but one name that we are all familiar with, getting closer to people like Bob Menendez. Bob Menendez's passion will not diminish, but let's give him more reason to redouble his efforts towards our cause. Finally, what I want to say about what Professor Lou Urinek said earlier, I would not fault the academic community in Greece as much as I would the Greek government. The academic community has done its part, for the most part, has done the research, has presented it. There are 14 volumes of Professor Fotiadis' research that should have been published in at least 5 languages, so the rest of the world would know. What are we doing? We're publishing it for maybe 11 million people. Out of those 11 million people, maybe 500,000 people will read it in Greek. The rest of the world needs to know. And at the same time, Greece, rather than to promote the cause for the recognition of the genocide of our people, they are impeding the progress by extracting historical information from the texts and replacing it with nonsense. One that I recently read, and I will share with you, was in place where there was historical content. They have a story about a monkey that is eating bananas and will not share it with a turtle. So the turtle, for revenge, is placing sharp stakes at the bottom of the tree and enticing the monkey to jump and impale itself, and then carving up the monkey and serving it to other monkeys. This is the story that is replacing the history of our people. So I would fault the Greek government. If this sounds like an attack on the Greek government, then so be it. But we need to refocus, and center our thoughts on what we can do. We cannot change the things that are outside of our control. So let's enhance the things that we have at our disposal and try to work with those. And this panel is one of those things that we have at our disposal to help us with the cause. And with that, honestly, I was unprepared for this. All I did was make notes and took some of your cues to help me along.
No, I appreciate that. I don't want anybody to think that this is an attack, against the Hellenic government or governments, I should say. I should use the plural. But I will say I thank you because you did bring up, obviously, 9/11. I am in Athens right now. And in fact, I'm having an event tomorrow at by invitation at the Athens Plaza, where we're actually going to have a remembrance program, and we're going to discuss 9/11. Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm here in Athens basically to make sure that the Americans, because we're Americans obviously, besides being of Hellenic descent, we're Americans, and we're going to obviously remember that, just like we're remembering, and we will never forget the genocide that has taken place. I found this conversation very interesting because we were here to talk about the 30-year genocide, which is beyond what we normally talk about, because I did like the title of that book, and they are correct when they refer to these genocides as being to a certain degree linked. It's not only a Hellenic genocide, but obviously an Assyrian genocide, and obviously an Armenian genocide. It was very interesting to me that Thea went back into history, which was very interesting, and some other people commented on that, including Professor Hadjidimitriou, with regards from the 14th century. So I found that part of the conversation extremely interesting. Ismini, if you can, We talk about frequently about the war of, 1919 to 1922, the so-called Greco-Turkish War, and that in fact affected, the way it was perceived, and that's why the genocide started. That's all BS. Can you just basically tell us, was there a war of 1919 to 1922? Why was the Hellenic military actually there? Does this mean you're here?
Yes, I'm right here, and thank you so much for asking this, because that's one of the misconceptions people have. And I, in fact, do not like calling it the Greco-Turkish War, because the Greeks were asked by the Allies to go to Smyrna and the wider area in order to make sure that the Turks were following the terms of the agreements or the treaty, and they were doing what they were supposed to do. For example, they were not supposed to be arming themselves, which they were doing. They were supposed to return property that they had stolen, including children and women, and they did not do that. So the Greeks were asked by the Allies to enforce the terms of the treaty, and the reason why they asked them to do it was they could not politically sustain that type of military presence themselves, because they had given so much to World War I, and the people, their constituency, if you will, back home, wanted the boys to return home and be there for Christmas, no more war. So the Greeks did have also an interest, because they wanted to protect the Christians, their Greek brethren, if you will, from being oppressed and persecuted by the Turks. So it was not really a war. Horton called it a continuation of World War I at the request of the Allied forces.
So in fact, it was not in fact a war where there was an invasion by the Hellenic military. They were actually asked to go there, and as you said, it was a continuation. It was a continuation of World War I. Even though everybody celebrated, World War I is over and all the rest of that, in reality, World War I did not end. And there was a discussion. I think it was you, Lou Urinek, who brought up a few of you actually brought up the and Zvinya, you did, and also Constantine. There was in fact this aspect of oil. This aspect of oil that they were concerned about, in particular Americans and others, that in fact they didn't want particular oil fields, to be taken over, and we've heard about this in the past. Anybody just want to have a brief mention of that or no?
Well, if I might say, it is ironic that Bristol and Dallas and the U.S. were really interested in getting U.S. access to the oil fields. And I'm saying it's ironic because, as it turned out, they did not really need it. The U.S. started producing oil more abundantly. And on top of that, some years later, there was an oil glut. So absolutely not necessary. So they're helping the Turks slaughter and drive Christians from their ancestral homes in the Near East. Did nothing else really but prepare the Middle East for a radical reality. In other words, as the minorities, including the Christians, were diminishing over the 100 years in the Middle East, the countries become more homogeneous. And studies have shown that the more homogeneous a country is, the more radical it becomes. And in this instance, if in the Muslim faith, then Sharia comes into play, and you can have the death penalty for apostasy and things like that. And we should not be surprised that terrorism can grow a lot easier in an environment like that, And therefore, we have 9/11, among other things. And we need to never forget that. So our foreign policy and what drives it, it has to be truth and it has to be moral, because otherwise it can come back and haunt us. And it did definitely with 9/11 in America.
I'd like to,
Can I go back, Lou?
yeah, please, Lou, go ahead.
On the Greek-Turkish War, I think we need to divide that war or continuation of World War I into two parts. When the Greeks landed, they weren't doing the Allies a favor. In a way they were. They were asked by the US and Britain to land, but Venizelos definitely had his designs on Smyrna. It was not an act of charity. It was Venizelos's intention to acquire a piece of the Ionian coast for the Greek mainland. I think we have to admit that. Now, the framework was going to be a plebiscite that would later be held, so it was going to be sort of above board and so forth. But the Greeks weren't doing anybody a big favor by landing at Smyrna, number one. Number two, I think we have to distinguish between the Venizelos approach and what happened with King Constantine. I suspect, and this is total speculation on my part, that if Venizelos had remained prime minister, that war would not have expanded. It was with the accession of Constantine and his vision. He wanted to take Constantinople. He had a vision of himself almost as a kind of a Byzantine king. And so that was the overreach. Okay, so there is the early part when the Greeks landed, with the invitation of the Allies and with a kind of moral claim, with a legal framework going forward on the Ionian coast. There was that, and then there was that which occurred afterwards. Once Constantine was back in power, there was something else going on, and the Greeks were trying to get more territory, right, and including Constantinople. So that's a very different picture than poor Greeks landing in 1919 for the Allies, and then
Lou, there's no doubt that the concept of the Megadi there, the big idea, the great idea, or what have you, to take back, the lands that were lost and all the rest of that, and to expand them, and certainly, like you mentioned, I think, the Balkan Wars, taking back, Macedonia, Epirus, etc. There was no doubt that all these thoughts were in some people's minds. With regards to Constantine, there was always this myth, this legend that another Constantine would take over the city, and I guess maybe it got to his head. But
there
I
are
think,
three of us here.
But I do think
irredentism is a very dangerous.
You're absolutely correct, and I think we should indicate that what's great about this particular symposium is we're having various professors, experts in the field, etc. Everybody has their own opinions, not necessarily what is being said today. And I think this is important, by the way. Not everything that's being said today is approved, agreed upon by the Archons, etc., or the Symposium committee. That's not the purpose of this particular thing, as we being the spokespeople for the Archons, which we're not. But what we do have here is scholars who have their particular perspectives, and it's interesting to see the dynamic of all the people. I will say one thing, though. The Hellenic genocide, including the Armenian and the Assyrian, they have not been recognized properly by the world, including the United States. And it is true what was stated before by Gus Tsiflidis, that in fact millions of dollars have been poured into different political scenarios in the United States and every nation in the world, by the way, with threats not to recognize a genocide. That's kind of shocking and ludicrous, by the way, And the fact, and I hate to say anything about Greece because I'm in Athens, the fact that our own people by our own people, I mean, our own people, not us, we're Americans, that in fact they themselves have been dulled in terms of expressing the true thought process and what actually took place. It's very shocking. It's very shocking to many of us. With that, we've taken a long time, by the way, to discuss this issue. I know in other circles, we've been doing this every year, discussing the genocide, because I think it's very important. What I'd like to do, because I was told originally that this thing should last about an hour, it never does, but that's okay.
Can I just say,
Please, sir.
well, you've brought up the 9/11 a number of times, and I lived about 10 blocks from the trade centers at the time. And I've written a piece for my blog called about the genocide. I don't remember what it's called, but I will list it again tomorrow, and I'll send copies, the links to everybody tomorrow. But I also want to say something about the last thing that was mentioned. It was not Constantine that went inland. I think our last conference, I talked about how Venizelos rescued the British in Constantinople from the Turks, from Ataturk. And then he was allowed to go to start. And it was only after Constantine came to power that the Allies turned against Greece because they didn't trust Constantine. But it was really Venizelos that began the war inland.
No, that's true. In terms of 9/11, since we're talking about 9/11, and I really have to mention it now, the only let's say religious church institution that was destroyed was Saint Nicholas. Okay, and the Archons obviously did have a hand and a role in the reconstruction of the church. I was honored after there was a stoppage of the original construction, the reconstruction, let's say, of the new church designed by Calatrava. I was honored to be asked by Father Alex and his Eminence, as well as John Katzimatidis, to be involved in the construction, and actually, on a pro bono basis, to help with finally building the church, which is a magnificent structure. And we always, on 9/11, it's always lit up and there's always a service, etc. So there will be a service, obviously, on 9/11, as there is since last year when we first lit up the church and had the appropriate event for it. So I think that has to be mentioned. I think what also has to be mentioned is the concept of the St. Nicholas Church being rebuilt, but also called the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine. And many people were confused about what that meant about National Shrine. But the concept was that this particular church is also a cenotaph. It's a cenotaph to those 3,000 who died on 9/11. And it's also in memory of those who are not buried there, obviously, but it's also a cenotaph, a monument also to them. And them was not only Christians, them was also Muslims and other faiths. And that becomes a very important thing. With that, what I'd like to do, if possible, is just have some final comments by everyone, if you can, and then we'll wrap it up. I'd like to start with that. Some final thoughts, concepts. Yeah, can you hear me? Or we're losing you? I guess.
He's buffering.
Okay, so we'll come back to Thea. Constantine Hatzidimitriou, some final thoughts, ideas?
A couple of points on what was said previously. I have not done extensive research on the Treaty of Lausanne, but I remember seeing documents that Venizelos and the Patriarchate used during that conference that talked about the massacres and protecting the Greek communities in Asia Minor. So there's that aspect that should be taken into account when we talk about the Greek landing and the Greek expansion. There was an aspect that I believe is documented concerning the protection. On the economic aspect that was brought up, we should never talk about this subject without mentioning Marjorie Housepian Dopkin. She also mentioned the financial aspects. And if you wade through her notes, you'll find some documentation concerning the oil interests and other commercial interests like the Chester concessions. It is an important topic for research. Maybe one of you will take it up in detail. I think that if you look at the documentation in terms of the administration at the time, which was well known for its corruption and economic shenanigans, you'll find that aspect was important. Final word, I am the only one on the panel that emphasized, I believe, to a great extent, the continuity from the late Byzantine period to the present. When you look at Asia Minor as a whole, and there is more continuity than discontinuity vis-a-vis Islam and the experience of the Christians in that part of the world over time. And as I mentioned, this is documented extensively in Briones' book. In fact, many of the communities that we talk about, Pontus survived to a greater extent than a lot of the other areas of Asia Minor, really came back in the 17th century. They were almost wiped out in the earlier periods. But that's another topic for another panel, I guess.
Gus, thank you so much for that. I will say one thing, that EMCA, the East Mediterranean Business and Cultural Alliance, will have an event on the 100th anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty in early November. So maybe you'd like to be on a panel also, and whoever else wants to be on a panel, we'll have that discussion, because I think we have to talk about it, because it's very important, and it comes up every other day, actually, because people are referring to it and not knowing what they're talking about. They have no clue as to what's in the treaty to begin with. Thea, are you back with us?
I'm back.
Okay, some final thoughts, for the discussion.
Well, I mean, this is a wonderful discussion. I'm really grateful that you invited me to take part in it. Great speakers, a lot of information, that was imparted today, which I think is very important. And unfortunately, I'd like to say something about Greece acknowledging these things. Marina Frango, she was the translator of Not Even My Name in Greece, and she's the translator of my new history book that will be published in Greece in I think in November. About 20 years ago, we went to the National Library, and we spoke to the director of the National Library in Athens and asked him to help me find history books on what took place. And he screamed at us and called us masochists because he denied the genocide, and we were, a bunch of masochists. So it's really interesting that he was the director of the National Library. And this has to change. Let's hope, if enough information is put out there, maybe it will change finally.
Thank you so much. Ismini, did we have some final thoughts from you?
Well, first of all, I echo what you say, Thea, and thank you for bringing it up, because when we do not want to face the truth, or we do not know the truth, it really is dangerous. And the truth is always important, and least of all because it helps guide our decisions in the future. So if we do not know what happened and why it happened, then we really would not be able to make wise decisions about current events. For example, if we deny the genocide or the persecution and we don't learn from it, how are we going to deal today with what's happening in China with the Uyghurs, or what is happening with the Azerbaijani government with the assistance of Turkey is trying to starve to death about 120,000 Armenian Christians in the Nagorno-Karabakh? I mean, we cannot say, well, genocide, what happened, it was 100 years ago, really was very sad, best be forgotten. No, we need to know the truth, because and we cannot, and I insist on that, reward genocide. We need to punish it. And as having brought the Lausanne Treaty up, thank you, Gus, that's part of the flaws, why the Lausanne Treaty is flawed, because it rewards genocide instead of punishing it.
Yeah, and I think we should also mention that recognizing this genocide does not mean that we hate the Turkish people.
No, absolutely not. No, absolutely not. I don't want anyone to get that impression.
And I think we have to mention that because when my mother and I went to Turkey in 1989 to search for a home, we told people what we were there for. My mother told him she was a Pontic Greek, and yet they were incredibly kind and helpful. Everyone we met was incredibly kind and helpful, and we should remember that.
No, we absolutely should. Lou, some thoughts on our discussion today?
Lou is gone.
Oh,
Lou's
Lou's gone?
Yeah.
Okay,
He has to leave.
He's there or he's not there?
No, he's not there. He texted us.
out.
Oh, he texted us. Okay, so with that, Gus, some final thoughts. So what are we doing in the, Gus? What are we doing in the U.S.? What are we going to do in the U.S.?
Well, and we are in the process, and some of you have been informed of this as well. We are in the process of organizing a committee that will methodically construct eventually a document that is designed to reach the hands of the sitting president, whether it be Biden now or whoever is the next president, whatever time frame that takes. We will do our due diligence and make sure that it does get into their hands to confirm what the two major houses had voted in alongside with the recognition of the Armenian genocide, because there is documentation within those bodies of documents that also recognizing the genocide of the Greeks and the Assyrians. So we will have more information on that. Lou is one of the mainstays in the construction of this committee, and some of you will be, if you haven't been already, will be approached to lend a hand. That being said, as I mentioned before, we have gone this kind of attempt to be eradicated from the face of the earth for over 8 centuries, but we are still here, which is testament to the strength of our culture and to the strength of our ancestors that transferred the belief in family and community and culture within us. And I want to thank you all very much for what you have done throughout your lives. You have dedicated your time to uncovering the truth. Keep on doing what you're doing, because like geologists, with each brush of with each stroke of the brush, you're uncovering new truths, and in the end, the truth will shine through.
Thank you so much, Gus, and thank you to the panelists. This fantastic panel that we have today, with everyone having their obviously opinions. And I'd like to thank also the Archons, in particular the Academic Symposium Committee. As I indicated before, we're not speaking for the Archons. We're just there as a committee to listen to what's out there in academia with regards to this very important topic, which has to do with the 30-year genocide. Thank you for being, to the audience, thank you for being with us today. And thank you again to the panelists and also Gus, the president of the Pan-Pontian Association, for being with us today. Thank you.